So exactly a week ago, I was invited to appear on Channel 4 News with Jon Snow, which was about 7:30 in the evening. And I was really nervous because some of you might know I do breakfast TV all the time. I'm the sort of token lefty on the Sky Newspaper Review. And I always think, when I'm doing breakfast TV, you know, people are trying to find their kids' gym kit or think about the presentation they've got that day. They're trying to get themselves out the door. So I always comfort myself by thinking, no one's really watching. Whereas, when you're doing evening news, people are really paying attention. So I was very, very nervous. And because of that, I tried to be very diplomatic in the answers that I gave. And I ended up saying nothing, really. And then afterwards, I have thousands of young people who follow me on Twitter, and in a sort of glorious role reversal, they said to me that was rubbish. And I was advised by one of them to be brave. She said, Natasha, please be brave, and don't be afraid to say what you really think, because you're speaking on behalf of us. And she was absolutely right. It is young people's needs that I serve. So what I'm about to say, some of it is a little bit controversial, but it's me being brave, as I was advised to be. So it was in 2007, actually, that I started working in schools. I went and I interviewed 400 teenagers, and I asked them what they would like to be taught as part of their PSHE program. And overwhelmingly, they told me that it was body image, which was quite revolutionary at the time, because this was pre-Gok-Wan, remember? And so I thought, okay, so I went and consulted with some experts, and I came up with some workshops and presentations on body image, and I started teaching them in schools. But I very quickly learned that it's impossible to address the issue of body image without understanding mental health. And so that's where the journey of working in schools took me. I thought that there is a gap in the market here for talking about mental health. So today, my organisation, the Self-Esteem Team, we offer presentations on exam stress, on self-harm, on mental well-being, on the culture of banter for boys, as well as body image. And we've worked with about 60,000 young people since 2008 in more than 250 schools throughout the UK. And I personally go into about 3 schools a week, and I see about 500 teenagers a week. And I think that that gives me not only a unique perspective, I think that also makes me incredibly privileged. So the question that I'm most asked by journalists is, this problem of mental health in young people, is it really as bad as we all think it is? And I kind of have to say, in the most optimistic way possible, it's worse. It's worse than we think it is, because the diagnostic criteria in CAMS, because CAMS services are so overstretched, are becoming really, really extreme. So in order to be diagnosed with a mental illness now, you have to be exhibiting very extreme symptoms. I remember I went to see Dr. Susie Orbach, who authored Fat as a Feminist Issue, speak at Parliament a couple of years ago. And she said, if somebody had come into my office 30 years ago and said, I'm cutting out whole food groups, I would have said, you've got a serious eating disorder and you need some treatment. She said, now that's advocated in Heat magazine. It's entirely normalised. And I think that there are all these children who are struggling with their mental health, but they're flying below the radar. We know that 3 children in an average classroom will have a diagnosed mental illness, but those statistics can't paint a reliable picture, I don't think, of how much young people are struggling with their mental health. So last August, when I was first appointed as the mental health champion, the Minister for Education and Childcare, Sam Jima, who is a total dude, by the way. I really like him. He's a force for good. I genuinely believe that, and he really wants to help. But he asked me a question, and the question that he asked me was, what does a good system of support for young people who are struggling with their mental health look like in schools? And I said, I don't know, but I'll find out. So I set about trying to answer that question, and I was drawing on the wisdom of the young people and the teachers and the charities that I was interacting with to try and answer that question. What does a good system of support look like? But as I was attempting to answer that question, I realised that whilst it was a good question, is actually the wrong question, because the question that we should be asking ourselves is, what are the emotional and mental health needs of all children, and are they being met in our schools? Because whilst 3 children in an average classroom have a diagnosed mental illness, all the children in that classroom have a mental health. A child or an adolescent's brain is not the same as an adult's brain. We're in a key, crucial developmental stage, and we need to feel safe, and we need to feel nurtured, and we need to feel valued. We need to have a creative outlet to express our emotions in a positive way. We need time and space to think. We need to be able to play. We need to know that we're supported and that we have someone that we can talk to who will listen to us without judgment. And if we don't meet these basic needs in our children, we risk them growing up not only without a sense of attachment, and we know that attachment is crucial for good mental health, but also with low self-esteem. And low self-esteem is one of the key diagnostic criteria for the 4 most common mental illnesses in young people, which are anxiety, depression, self-harm, and eating disorders. So of course, it's incredibly important that young people have support for mental illnesses if they need it. But what's equally important is that we ask ourselves, what is causing this crisis in young people's mental health in the first place? Because it's my belief that many of these struggles could be avoided if we get our approach right. And if we don't, we're giving with one hand and taking away with the other. And we run the risk of medicalizing childhood. The way it was explained to me by educational psychologists is that, if you take those 3 children who have a diagnosed mental illness, perhaps one of them would have genetically always been destined to have a mental illness. And of course, their environment will determine the onset and the severity of that mental illness. But it's part of their genetic makeup. But for 2 of them, they're just responding to something that is happening to them. If a child is being bullied and they have symptoms of depression because they're being bullied, what they need is for the bullying to stop. They need to feel safe again. They don't necessarily need antidepressants or therapy. And this brings me to the crux of what I want to say to you today, because time and time again, over recent years, young people and the people who teach them have spoken out about how a rigorous culture of testing and academic pressure is detrimental to their mental health. At one end of the scale, we've got 4-year-olds being tested. At the other end of the scale, we've got teenagers leaving school facing the prospect of leaving university with record amounts of debt. Anxiety is the fastest growing illness in under 21s. These things are not a coincidence. I would defy anybody not to feel anxious, given some of the circumstances that young people face in Britain today. That doesn't make them mentally ill, just makes them aware of what is happening around them. We have all these naysayers who celebrate their ignorance. They say that life is tough and competitive and children need to be acclimatized to stress. But they're part of the problem. I am an honorary member of Epping Upper Clapton Rugby Club because my dad's the chairman, not because I play rugby. And I know quite a lot about rugby as a result. I know that children below the age of 12 are not allowed to push in a rugby scrum, because we acknowledge that their bones, their skeletal structure can't take it. They're not grown enough to be able to do that. It's exactly the same with mental health. You cannot apply an adult amount of pressure to a child's brain and expect them to cope. And being a young person today is, despite what any of you might think, harder than it's ever been. Yes, children have more stuff. They have more possessions. They have more of what they don't need. They have less of what they do need. Parents work long hours. Family time, when it is spent together, is spent staring at screens. The culture of schools has become fiercely competitive, and all of this is exacerbated and magnified by this relentless pace that is set by the internet. Online, children are exposed to cyberbullying, advertising messages that tell them they aren't good enough, pornography, airbrush lives. And they're living in this world where the fundamental values aren't set by kindness, by doing the right thing by your fellow person. They're set by consumerism. And all of this, they are trying to comprehend with a brain that is still in its fundamental key developmental stages. We're talking about independent schools today, and I do think that independent schools, sometimes the pressure to achieve academically is more rigorous. But equally, this is not just a problem in independent schools. You know, we work in the independent and the state sector, and if you throw poverty and lack of aspiration into that mix, the results can be catastrophic. Young Minds did a survey in 2014, and it was pioneering because I think so often, and this is, I'm not trying to diss charities because obviously they're wonderful, but so often with charities, they ask the people that they're surveying leading questions to try and get the answers that they want. Young Minds simply asked 4,000 young people what bothers them, what would make your life easier. And 4 things came out of this survey: bullying, exam stress, body image worries, and sexual pressure arising chiefly from pornography. And there are still some people who would insist on seeing those things as inconsequential, as being somehow divorced from mental health or mental illness. Constantly sneer at this narcissistic generation. Or even worse, we've started to misuse these words like resilience, character, grit, as though struggling with a mental illness is somehow a defect in the individual, rather than a response to a culture which makes it difficult to enjoy good mental health. Our stories don't end when we leave school. In fact, they're just beginning. And we need to ask ourselves, ultimately, what is education for? Of course, we'd all agree in this room that an education should prepare us for life, but what kind of life are we preparing these young people for? I want young people to leave school with an ability to nurture their health and look after themselves. And I want them to leave knowing that they are valued, that they're important, and that their feelings and concerns are listened to, because actually, those are the things that make you really resilient. The research I've conducted since August has allowed me to better understand the challenges that are being faced by the education system. Increasingly, schools are absorbing the consequences of cuts to CAMS. So teachers are attempting to deal with actually quite serious mental health issues with no training and no budget. Ofsted have introduced new well-being criteria. It was a nice idea, wasn't it? But so often what they're doing, rather than measuring a school's ability to effectively look after children's needs, they're pushing issues like bullying underground, increasing the stigma of them. And stigma is still rife. More and more expectation is being placed on schools to provide effective support without the schools being supported themselves to do that. Now, I don't want you to finish listening to me feeling depressed, because that would be ironic, apart from anything else. And there has been some positive progress, and I want to share with you some of the things that have happened that I think are really positive. The Institute for Public Policy Research is publishing some recommendations later this year, and I really, really hope that they are listened to. What they are suggesting is that schools should have the autonomy to design their own system of support, because in fact a good system of support isn't just one thing. It would include an excellent PSHE programme, perhaps a peer-to-peer support system, perhaps a school counsellor, perhaps a hub-style system like is provided by charities such as Place to Be. They can devise their own system of support, and they are to be given a budget in order to implement it. And, this is quite useful for independent schools to know, schools have to identify a beacon school that is already doing this in the way that they would like to, so that they can, in a sort of academy-style way, I suppose, copy what they're doing. And there are some independent schools out there who have fantastic wellbeing programs. The Grange is one of them, and that's where you could really come into your own. You could be beacon schools for other schools to copy. The Youth Select Committee have published a report recommending that mental health be a significant component of teacher training, and that has been taken on board, so that new people entering the profession have some expertise in this area. The DFE have called for evidence from schools to understand the best way to implement peer-to-peer support networks. Now, peer-to-peer support networks have been shown to be not only cost-effective, but just effective generally in improving well-being. But I should add a caveat here that I think the reason for that is that peer-to-peer support systems tend to operate within schools where well-being is a huge part of the culture anyway, where well-being is really valued. The PSHE Association have published some excellent guidelines on how to talk about mental health in lessons. And all of that is incredibly positive, but it's nowhere near enough to tackle the extent of this crisis. And it's mainly because all of those initiatives are addressing symptoms rather than root causes. What do children need? What they need is an attitude shift. The school system needs to be revolutionised to acknowledge the realities of modern life. Well-being needs to be at the heart of our curriculum, not tacked on as an afterthought. Children need teachers who aren't being pushed to the brink of mental breakdown themselves because of their stress and workload. Children need time to think and process and play. They need to feel that whatever their talent or skill set, they're still valued. In short, children need to understand that we care. Now, these opinions that I'm presenting to you today, they aren't new. I've said it all in my columns for the Times Educational Supplement and at government level. I've said this. And they haven't made me very popular in certain circles, but I will continue to say them, because it's too important not to. Education doesn't mean anything unless it happens within the context of a healthy mind. We will never know what our young people are capable of, what their potential truly is, if they're too crippled by self-loathing and feelings of helplessness to reach that potential. So you take one thing away from today, please let it be this: education is nothing without well-being. Thank you for listening.